5 enemy fighters closed in across a 1.4-mile spread, converging on a single U.S. rookie diving away at 430 mm, altitude delta just 2,700 feet. Intercept in 18 seconds. Radios crackled across the Japanese formation. This wasn't a chase. It was a trap. The American was boxed in, except he wasn't, at 10,300 feet. The rookie didn't pull left, didn't climb, didn't jink. He nosed down further, 78 ground into a dive so steep it blurred the horizon. His airspeed jumped to 445 mAh, dangerously close to elevator lockout. No flaps, no wingman, no orders. His training manual had one name for this kind of descent panic dive, but he wasn't panicking. He did something else, subtle, wrong. He trimmed the rudder not to stabilize, but to destabilize. The nose yawed. The plane looked like it was tumbling. Behind him, the lead fighter fired and missed. The next broke formation. A third disappeared into cloud cover. 17 seconds later, all 5 enemy fighters had lost visual, and the rookie was behind them. Manual called it reckless. What it actually did was worse. Solomon Islands, June 1944. Mission single aircraft rearguard delay. 3 weeks earlier. Cadet Peter Holbrook sat alone in a folding metal chair under the tropical sun. Helmet beside him. Sweat-soaked flight suit unzipped to the chest. His instructor, Lit McGarrison, towered above the chalkboard on the tarmac. Eyes locked on one number, 74 degrees. That's what you logged in your dive profile yesterday. 74 degrees. Garrison's voice was flat. Son, what the hell were you trying to do? Impress gravity. Holbrook didn't answer. He knew better. It had happened during a mock pursuit in a worn-out F6F Hellcat. His simulated opponent had reversed into a high yo-yo above him. Holbrook had pushed over not just to gain speed, but to sell the image of a loss. What he found was something stranger, a feeling that the plane floated during the dive, not simply fell. The aircraft slipped in yaw just slightly, changing its angle of closure, without ever pulling hard. It let him reverse under the opponent. Accidental. Maybe. But it had worked. Garrison didn't see it that way. 2 more degrees, he said, tapping the chalk again. And you're over the stall zone at dive recovery. You know what happens at 450 Malik, mate? 76 degrees, and a mushy elevator? Yes, sir, Holbrook replied. You die. Garrison crossed his arms. No. You black out first, then you die. The other trainees laughed behind him. They had reason to. Holbrook was young, only 19, with less than 42 flight hours. His instructors had marked him as nervous on roll, slow to recover from G, and overcommits dive envelope. The last line on his flight log that week read, corrects late. Does not abort steep dives soon enough. The word going around the ready room was simple panic diver. The kind of rookie who'd stay in a vertical too long, the kind who'd get a kill once, and then lose his wings trying it again. But Holbrook didn't argue. He took the mockery in silence, because deep down, he remembered what the aircraft had done. Not stalled, not lost lift, just slid, slightly off-axis. And it had opened an angle his opponent didn't expect. Still, that wasn't doctrine. And doctrine was clear. Do not initiate steep dives below 7,000 feet unless escaping active pursuit. Do not exceed 68 degrees under any circumstance without coordinated rollout. Do not allow trim offset to exceed 0.9 degrees in a dive. Holbrook had broken all 3, so they grounded him for 48 hours. Grounded for flying a dive that looked like panic, grounded for doing something that no one could explain, and that nobody wanted to see again. But fate doesn't check the manual, and in just 4 weeks, that exact dive would be his only way out at 10,300 feet, with 5 fighters above him and no friendly radio contact. U.S. Navy doctrine in 1944 was brutally simple: energy first, angles second, safety always. Fighters like the F6F Hellcat were built to climb, dive, and disengage, not to linger in the vertical traps. Dive angles were regulated for a reason. Beyond 68 degrees, airspeed built too fast, past 440 mph, control forces stiffened, pulled too late below 6,000 feet, and the aircraft wouldn't respond in time. That wasn't theory. It was written in accident reports. The Hellcat itself was forgiving, but not magical. At combat weight of 13,500 pounds, it handled cleanly through most envelopes. Stall speed hovered around 98 mph clean. But in steep dives, the long fuselage and heavy engine created inertia that punished hesitation. The elevator remained effective, but only inside a narrow window. Miss it by half a second, and recovery altitude vanished. That's why instructors hated what Holbrook did. He didn't dive shallow and extend. He didn't roll to control closure. He pointed straight down, stayed too long, and let the aircraft accelerate past 430 miles. Worse, he introduced rudder trim offset during the dive. Doctrine warned explicitly against this. A trim error beyond 1 brs in high-speed descent could induce yaw instability. Instructors called it inviting a spin. But Holbrook had noticed something doctrine ignored. At extreme dive angles between 74 degrees and 80 degrees, the Hellcat didn't behave like it did in shallow dives. The airflow over the fuselage changed. The wings were no longer the primary lifting surface. The aircraft became a falling body with control authority, biased by torque and drag. Small inputs produced exaggerated lateral shifts, not turns. Shifts. That mattered. Enemy fighters, especially A6M Zeros, were trained to solve lead angles, not disappearing vectors. In a normal dive, pursuit geometry was predictable. The attacker aimed where the target would be. But when the target's nose slid off axis without banking, the math broke. Holbrook's dive violated 3 core rules: exceeded max dive angle by 10, 12 degrees, stayed in the dive past recommended recovery point, used trim to destabilize instead of stabilize. On paper, it was wrong. In practice, it created something new, a vertical float. The Hellcat didn't just fall, it hovered momentarily relative to pursuers, bleeding their closure while preserving its own altitude advantage on exit. That's why the instructors called it a panic dive. To them, it looked uncontrolled, unsafe, amateur. But Holbrook wasn't losing control, he was delaying commitment. And when 5 enemy fighters formed beneath him weeks later, stacked between 6,000 and 9,000 feet, expecting him to level out and run the weakness of the Hellcat became its trap. Because once he entered that wrong dive, none of them wanted to follow it all the way down. And none of them realized what that meant until they looked up and found him still above them. The sky over Kolombangara was glassy and brutal. Sun high, no clouds above 13,000 feet. Cadet Holbrook flew alone at 10,700 feet, patrolling a return corridor for straggling bombers. He was supposed to stay in formation, only he was the last tail-end Charlie left. Then came the first shadow. He spotted the lead Zero at 11 o'clock high, about 1.6 miles out, altitude 12,400 feet, a second flanked right, slightly lower, then 3 more angled spread, boxing his flanks from 9,800 to 18,600 feet. They weren't diving yet, they were herding. Holbrook checked his panel fuel, 52%. Oil temp, 2 degrees. Throttle, 88%. Trim neutral. Speed 212 mph. He rolled right slightly. Checked below ocean, glinting at 3,000 feet. No cover, no clouds, nothing to hide behind. He banked left instead. But the Zeros adjusted. They weren't chasing, they were shaping a kill cone. Within 22 seconds, The lead Zero would be in firing range. The air geometry was collapsing. He had two choices: turn left into the low pair but lose energy and risk a high-speed bracket from above. Climb to break upward, but he'd bleed speed too quickly and get stalled mid-turn. Both were textbook traps. There was one forbidden option: left dive straight. But it wasn't that simple. At his current altitude, a steep dive over 74 degrees would place him below 5,500 feet in under 7 seconds, with recovery pulling close to 4.5 G if initiated late. Not safe, not standard, not authorized. Holbrook blinked fast. The fighters weren't attacking yet. They were waiting for him to make the obvious move, extend away. Roll shallow, show belly. Instead, he clicked left rudder trim, poir 1.3 deg, set elevator trim slightly down, and locked his jaw. He would go nose down, but not clean, not fast. He'd go wrong, the angle steep, the trim offset. The goal disappear vertically, not to escape, but to force a chase none of them wanted. He nosed down slowly, 5 degrees, 12 degrees, 20 seconds, then past 60 degrees, his airspeed began to spike 282 maps, 317, 339, 363 miles. The Zeros didn't dive yet, still adjusting. Holbrook didn't wait. At 70 km, he entered freefall with yaw offset, just enough to start a false roll. He wasn't diving to run, he was diving to delay, because if the Zeros followed, they'd lose spacing. If they didn't, he'd be behind them before they could turn. And that's when the nose began to vibrate at 430 twump, 9,400 feet, still dropping. At 9,400 feet, Cadet Holbrook's Hellcat screamed through the dive, 78 degree nose down, offset trim making the nose yaw 3 degree and left without bank. His airspeed surged 432, 444, 451 any harder, and his elevator would stiffen beyond safe return. His hands trembled against the stick, but his mind stayed locked. Behind him, the Zeros committed. The lead dove clean, expecting a textbook escape arc. The second followed. The others hesitated just long enough. Holbrook didn't wait to see. He made the next move flatten. He pushed forward another 2 degrees, then trimmed nose up and tapped right rudder. The Hellcat didn't climb it curved. A shallow arc formed at 600-700 feet, leveling him out at 3.6 degree nose angle. Airspeed bled fast, 451 I, 412, 386 map. The G-forces hit hard, 3.2 G, then 3.8 G as the tail flexed. Control held. 1-0 couldn't match it. Overshooting at 470 miles. Its dive extended too long. By the time it pulled out, Holbrook had already reversed heading by 47 degrees. That Zero never turned back. Kill no, but gone. Then came the second Zero closer, smarter. It cut power mid-dive to preserve turn radius. Rolling right to snap into a high-speed low yo-yo. But Holbrook's false flatten tricked it. What looked like a pull-out was a drift. The Zero passed low at 800 yards, expecting to climb. Holbrook stayed flat, flipped flaps 6 degrees, and tapped left rudder to skid turn. He got 1 clean second, trigger down, 0.8 second burst, 1 wing shredded, the Zero flipped, smoked, and vanished behind his canopy. Confirmed kill, 2 out, 3 more hunting. Holbrook checked instruments, altitude 6,300 FT, speed 368 mph and dropping. Oil temp, 200 hydrogen, fuel 48%. Ammunition, 300 rounds per gun. He began climbing shallow 6 degree nose up. Barely enough to gain space, but not so sharp to bleed speed. The airframe groaned. Ailerons still responsive, but loose. Rudder input delayed. The third Zero saw him rising and dove to meet him head on. Holbrook stayed level. Not evasive, inviting. The Zero committed. At 390 km closure, they aligned for a joust. Holbrook faked left with rudder, held the bank neutral, then pulled a 4 degree slide roll to the right. The Zero opened fire too late. Rounds stitched his left wingtip but missed core. Holbrook fired back, 0.7 second burst. Sparks, Smoke. The Zero veered off, venting from the cowling. Probable. 3 engaged. 2 remained, and they'd seen the trick. They didn't dive. They went wide and boxed. The last 2 Zeros didn't chase. They learned from the first wave. Holbrook could feel the change. Even before he saw it, his instincts fired before his eyes did. They weren't hunting. They were shaping. At 6,200 feet. He leveled out. Airspeed falling to 342 millicup. He scanned left 10 now high, about 11,800 feet, staying back at a wide arc. Another slid lower, at 5,300 feet, keeping station to intercept any straight-line escape. Together, they formed a vertical gate, one above, one below, neither pressed in. They waited. Holbrook checked trim. Rudder offset, 1.3 degmau. Elevator slightly nose down. Oil temp, 294 degmau. Ammunition under 250 rounds per gun. Still no clouds. He couldn't dive again. Altitude floor was 3,000 feet. And anything past 60 degree now would trap him in torque roll without recovery space. He couldn't climb. Both Zeros would pinch. He couldn't run. They'd overtake. So he turned. Slowly. Wide arc, right bank angle, 18 degree. Throttle to 75%. Nose up, just 3 degree. The Zero above mirrored. The one below shifted too, pacing him from the bottom edge of his climb vector. They weren't rushing him anymore. They were shaping escape logic, forcing him into textbook countermeasures. Make the American turn. Make him bleed speed. Make him climb just enough to stall his dive recovery. Then, when he flattens out, drop in and kill him with angles. Holbrook knew the trap. It was one he'd been taught used, even in mock dogfights, against a smart opponent. A diving fighter could be boxed by vertical spacing. High attacker pressures him into a shallow turn. Low attacker closes when he flattens. The dive buys time, but not distance. Only one way to beat it, force one to break formation. But how he keyed trim forward slightly more, nose down, and reversed his turn mid-climb. The Zero above twitched, adjusting late. The one below lagged. For 2 seconds, their bracket loosened. Not enough. Holbrook flattened. Both Zeros reset. High one maintained altitude. Low one sped up. They were correcting now. Tighter than before. Then came the bad news. His throttle response lagged, engine bogged as fuel pressure dipped. He saw the gauge fuel line, NUC2 fluttering. Mixture unstable. His climb had burned too much power. His speed dropped to 328 mph, and he was drifting toward the lower Zero's cone. No space to dive, no time to reverse. Rudder feel gone soft. Aileron still responsive, but heavy. He'd held the center too long, and now the altitude that once saved him was gone. At 5,400 feet, Holbrook tried to climb again gently, just 4 degree nose up, aiming to force a pitch fight and lure 10 in. But the Hellcat answered late. The stick felt mushy. Elevator trim was already set slightly down from his earlier dive, and now it pushed against him. He keyed back trim nothing. Elevator response dropped below 60% efficiency. Throttle 83%, but the engine didn't surge. Fuel mix trembled. Oil temp climbed to 299 WWII. RPMs unsteady. A glint of light flickered across the canopy. It was the lower Zero circling up to meet him from below. Holbrook banked shallow right 20-degree angles, standard drift. Nothing aggressive. He didn't have the energy for a roll, but even that was too slow. The high Zero swooped in, not firing, just closing space. They were running the cage tighter now, coiling him into the no-maneuver zone. He needed vertical space, fast. He pulled harder, nose up 6 degree, but the Hellcat lagged. Speed dropped 325, 310, 298 mm. Then came the warning rudder flutter, buffeting, not enough airflow. Stall onset at 91 mm. Holbrook knew it was coming. The aircraft wobbled, nose still rising. He'd overcommitted. For a second, he tried to flatten the pitch, But the controls were unresponsive. Left wing dipped. Torque spun right. Altimeter dropped, 4,900 feet, 4,700, 4,300. He was falling. Not diving. Falling. Engine still turning, but no lift. Then how instinct he chopped throttle to 45%, kicked hard right rudder, and tapped right aileron. The plane didn't level, it yawed. Not a coordinated turn, a skid. And somehow it held. The Hellcat slid sideways. Nose pointed 32 degree off travel vector, descending at 1,900 F-min, but not tumbling. Not yet. The Zeros hesitated. One began to line up on his 6, but the angle was strange. Holbrook's profile was all wrong. No straight line. No horizon lock. No expected recovery vector. He looked like a dying aircraft twisting into the ocean. So they didn't fire. They waited, and that gave him a window. At 3,900 feet, he rammed throttle back to 80%. Feathered flaps 3 to gyre and tried to pull level. It didn't work, not fully. The aircraft shuddered. Oil temp hit 302 to gap. Right wing lagged behind in lift, so he didn't level. He turned not with bank, but with yaw, using rudder drag to pivot the nose. It wasn't a turn in the manual sense. It was a pivot stall, barely stable, dangerously slow. But it did something critical. It reversed his heading while still falling, and when the Zeros adjusted, they overshot. They expected collapse. They got sideways fire instead. Holbrook's next shot came too late to kill, but just in time to survive. What Holbrook had done didn't exist in any Navy playbook. It wasn't a dive, not a slip, not a roll. It was an intersection of desperation and physics, a high-speed, off-axis yaw float that reversed geometry without using a classic turn. It was born not from intention, but from failure. Here's what happened. Piece by piece, as Holbrook's airspeed fell below 300 millimouth, his elevator effectiveness degraded. Attempting to climb induced a stall onset, but instead of falling nose first, he input rudder and partial aileron not to roll, but to offset torque. This allowed the aircraft's fuselage to yaw up to 30 cubiculus off its actual travel vector. That drift, combined with flap drag and a partial throttle cut, caused the aircraft to enter a skidding float not unlike a helicopter pivot, but with fixed-wing aerodynamics. The result from an external view, the Hellcat appeared to stall, then rotate horizontally mid-descent, while preserving a nose angle near level. To any chasing pilot, it looked like a stall spin collapse. To Holbrook, it was a momentary pause between losing lift and regaining control. The conditions that made it possible were razor-thin, airspeed 294-3112 mph. Rudder input 60-80% full right. Aileron roll 12-18%, right deflection. Trim nose down, 1.1. Rudder offset, 1.3 degree. Flap setting 360. Throttle cut down to 45% mid-float, then back to 80%. What this achieved was a tactical ghosting. Instead of diving or turning out, Holbrook floated across the pursuer's firing arc without matching their geometry. The Hellcat didn't behave like a plane anymore, it behaved like a problem. No lead solution, no classic turn response. It seemed broken. That misdirection bought him 3 to 5 seconds. Enough for the two Zeros to split their reaction. One climbed high. One turned hard right to realign. That separation killed the bracket. The maneuver, if it can be called one, wasn't built for offense. It was a reset usable only when the enemy committed to the wrong vector. It couldn't be sustained. It risked stall, engine overspeed, rudder lockout, or spin. But in the hands of a pilot low on options and too stubborn to die by the book, it worked. Holbrook hadn't invented a turn. He'd invented a refusal. He refused to fall, refused to bank, refused to give the enemy what they expected geometry. And in doing so, he created 1 second of superiority. That was all he needed. And now, 2 Zeros had lost track of his motion, which meant Holbrook was no longer the hunted. He was the one falling behind them with enough altitude for just one more move. At 800 feet, Holbrook had no time, no doctrine, and just enough speed to try something nobody had trained him for twice. His airspeed hovered at 312 mph. Climbing slightly, both Zeros were repositioning one above, looping into a descending turn, the other lower and wide, banking in for re-engagement. He needed to execute now. Throttled to 100%, he pushed the stick forward gently, letting the nose dip to 12 Mach. Rudder trim neutral, flaps retracted. He wasn't going for a dive, not a full one, just a feint. Airspeed ticked up 318 mph, 328, 340 mph. He rolled shallow left, 19-degree bank, then snapped hard right with rudder and stick. The Hellcat hesitated, flexed, then obeyed. The yaw turn began not smooth, but sharp, jerky, dragging the nose 38 degrees across the horizon. He wasn't trying to outturn a Zero, he was trying to get sideways beneath their targeting window. The upper Zero Dove committed too early. It missed his drift entirely, shooting through the old vector. Holbrook flattened, adjusted nose, 2 degrees, and opened fire. Range 240 yards, time 0.9 seconds. Rounds fired 36 per gun. Hits registered. Right wing, cockpit. The Zero pitched over and spiraled. Confirmed kill, 2 left. Holbrook pulled up 7.4 degrees in pitch, airspeed dropping to 301 map, then 294 mapper. The Hellcat rattled frame stressed but holding. G-force ticked near 3.6 G, not sustainable. Then came the lower Zero, coming in fast from his 5 o'clock angle, near perfect, range collapsing. Holbrook had 1 second. He cut throttle to 55%, flared flaps 6 degrees, and snapped into a high-speed skid, not a turn, not a roll, a forced side slip. The Zero fired tracers stitched his left side but overshot. Holbrook reversed rudder, counter-rolled left, and looped under the attacker's path. 3. He raised throttle to 88%, retracted flaps. 2. The Zero began to pull up, predicting a vertical stall. Wrong. 1. Holbrook rolled left again, now 34-degree bank, nose level. The Zero was there, now. 7.7-second burst, range 210 yards, hit pattern left engine cowl, cockpit, wing root. The Zero flared, vented smoke, and spun. Probable kill, 1 enemy remained, altitude 4,600 feet. Fuel, 41% oil temp, 308 degrees of ammunition, under 200 rounds per gun. Airspeed, 317 mph as Holbrook exhaled. He was still alive. But the last Zero hadn't run. It circled high, 11 o'clock, distant, climbing. It had watched the whole fight, and now it turned back in alone, and faster than before, because this time it knew his trick. Holbrook didn't wait for the Zero to commit. He couldn't. His aircraft was heavy, hot, and bleeding energy fast. He nosed down gently, just 3 degrees, enough to regain 325 map, but shallow enough to preserve altitude. The Hellcat groaned from stress. Oil temp now 312 degrees. Fuel dipping to 38%. He glanced left. The final Zero was descending fast from 5,800 feet. Bearing slight east, it wasn't making the same mistake as the others. It was staying offset. Trailing, not overcommitting. Smart. Holbrook rolled left 20 degree bank, then cut back right, showing the faintest hint of retreat. Not a dive, not a fight, just fatigue. Bait. He throttled back to 68%, let the nose droop naturally. The Zero bit. It dove in from above, building closure. Distance, on knee you at 200 yards and falling. Holbrook forced a drift right, using the Hellcat's yaw response to flatten his profile. No lead angle, just a stubborn wall of metal skimming the horizon. Then came the first burst. Tracers zipped past his right wing. Holbrook counted the seconds. He needed 6, just 6, to let the Zero believe he was running. 5. He cut throttle to idle. 4. Nose down, 7 degree, speed at 330 km/h. 3. Flaps out to 8 degree, slight left rudder. 2. Hard bank left 33 degree. Nose up 30 degree. 1. Throttle back to 95%, flaps retracted. Now, the Hellcat bucked from the sudden torque, but the maneuver worked. The airframe flared just enough to vector sideways. The Zero committed to a high-speed dive overshot and climbed vertical to avoid collision. Holbrook had no angle for a shot, but he didn't need one. He turned toward the ocean throttle at max, letting the cooling airflow cut engine temp back to 303 degrees. The Zero didn't follow. It had seen 5 of its comrades fall or vanish, and Holbrook no longer looked like prey. He looked like bait. At 4,100 feet, Holbrook skirted the cloud line, eyes scanning wide. No more contacts. His wings were pitted. Left aileron slightly unresponsive, but he was flying, and he had options. Return straight. Too risky. The bombers were gone. His squadron was inbound from another vector. He turned south, 152-degree heading, aimed toward a known picket destroyer 16 miles away, fuel 29% airspeed, 312 MEP gun ammo, less than 150 rounds per gun. He'd made it, but he couldn't prove what he did. Not yet. Unless the camera film held, and unless command was willing to believe it. And that was the next fight, because what he'd just flown was banned. The destroyer USS Hilbert picked up Holbrook's Hellcat at 17:42 hours. Tail low, smoke trailing faint from the exhaust, left wing visibly scored. He landed hard 240 mutton with a bounce that nearly lost the tail wheel. Ground crew rushed in. They expected damage, maybe wounds, but Holbrook climbed out unhurt. A radio man escorted him below deck, where a combat debrief officer waited clipboard in hand, skeptical before he even asked the first question. Holbrook described the engagement as best he could. 5 confirmed. 6th evaded. Maneuver was non-standard. He didn't try to name it. The next day, the aircraft's gun camera film was developed grainy, barely legible, but enough. 2 kill bursts were visible, 1 confirmed, 1 probable, 1 partial impact at mid-range. The film didn't capture the full float maneuver, but it did show the moment Holbrook's aircraft yawed out of line, then reappeared behind a Zero seconds later. That raised questions. The maintenance report didn't help. It noted trim settings out of spec rudder offset, 1.3 degree Ulst elevator, plus 0.9 degree. Elevator linkage strained from overextension. Throttle response delayed mid-flight. Airframe stress near limits for vertical recovery. In other words, he'd broken every rule they told him not to. Holbrook's squadron commander wasn't impressed. This wasn't a maneuver, he said during debrief. This was chaos that worked. Another officer called it aggressive mishandling, but they couldn't ignore the numbers. 5 enemy fighters engaged. 3 confirmed kills, 1 later verified from another pilot's report. 1 F6F Hellcat returned under its own power. 0 combat damage from direct hits, only proximity scarring. Then came the final decision from Group Flight Ops. The maneuver would not be named. It would not be taught. It would not be logged officially. Instead, the report was sealed under atypical encounter, probable improvisation. A line was added, no further investigation recommended. Maneuver deemed non-replicable under standard conditions, but the gun camera footage didn't disappear. 1 copy was quietly made, filed not under tactics, but airframe response studies. And another was requested by a senior flight instructor at Espiritu Santo, who saw something else. He paused the film at the moment of yaw, noted the timing, the trim, the roll delay. He didn't call it a trick. He called it a control inversion under threat. And weeks later, in a private briefing, he told 2 new trainees, if your engine's hot, your altitude's low, and your escape vector's gone, there's one thing that might work. But I never said this. The Navy would try to bury it. But rumors fly faster than doctrine. And pilots remember what saves lives, even when the manual says it's wrong. Holbrook's name didn't appear in official tactics manuals. No page described what he'd done, but within 6 weeks of his encounter, something strange began to show up in Hellcat's squadron training flights around the Solomon chain, especially among rookies rotated into mixed experience units. They started flying dirty dives, not full vertical plummets, not emergency dives for escape. Instead, they'd enter 70, 74-degree dives with slight rudder trim and introduce controlled yaw during deceleration. No two looked the same. Most didn't produce kills. But the intent was clear. These were attempts to recreate Holbrook's sudden reversal float. Instructors noticed. In VF-34 and VF-27, debrief notes began to include phrases like overcommits dive, recovers off axis, uses yaw slide to delay bracket, unstable vector used to split pursuit. Unofficially, pilots started calling it the ghost pull. Nobody could prove where the term came from, but more than a few said they'd heard it from someone who knew the kid who flipped the bracket on 5 zeros. One instructor, reviewing 16mm film from a practice intercept near Bougainville, marked the flight as improper recovery, but he kept the reel. When asked why, he said it wasn't right, but it looked like it worked. By late 1944, at least 3 squadrons had pilots referencing the maneuver in private notebooks. No formal doctrine adopted it, but it existed in the shadows between regulation and desperation. A move you didn't admit to planning, but trained yourself to feel. Cadet Peter Holbrook never saw a Navy flight manual mention the maneuver he used. He received 1 citation exemplary initiative under duress and was promoted to full ensign within 40 days. No official award, no public story. By March 1945, he'd logged 118 combat hours and flown escort for carrier strikes off Okinawa. On April 2nd, his aircraft suffered an engine failure on climb out. He bailed out at 3,200 feet, was recovered by destroyer, and grounded for medical review due to concussion symptoms. He never flew combat again. The aircraft. His original F6F Hellcat Bureau number 41609 was written off, salvaged for parts. But its flight data, quietly copied by a junior engineering officer, showed control anomalies during vertical maneuvers data that found its way into a 1946 post-war review titled Nonlinear Control Behaviors in High-Stress Airframes. The maneuver itself never got a name in Navy records, but among a handful of pilots who flew after Holbrook and who had heard whispers of the ghost pull, it survived in code trim wrong, fall right, nose through, not over. That line appeared in at least 2 pilot notebooks recovered after the war. A dive that wasn't sanctioned, a drift that wasn't trained, and a victory that no one could explain except the man who lived it. Your mission, reconstruct what Holbrook discovered, train your instincts, break the geometry. The manual won't save you. Only the wrong move at the right time will.